Two kids were playing a game, completely unaware of the eerie figures flickering outside the sliding glass door. This was a world overrun by zombies, a post-apocalyptic nightmare that had lasted for 6 years. Remarkably, this brother and sister had managed to survive in this isolated villa all this time, something very few could pull off. The dangers they faced were far greater than anyone could imagine. One day, a couple drove up to the villa. Jim greeted them, holding a toy gun. The man immediately asked, "Where are your parents?" Jim stayed silent, but the man just smiled and said, "See you next time." That night, Jim locked all the doors and windows tightly with his sister. Outside, a few zombies lingered, waiting for any chance to break in. By morning, they were still safe. Jim checked the bullets in the magazine. It turned out the toy gun wasn't so ordinary after all. As the brother and sister went outside to play as usual, the same pickup truck from the day before pulled up once again. This time, the couple's attitude was much firmer. They asked again, "Where are your parents?" Jim lied, saying they had gone into town to gather supplies. But there was no fooling two grown adults with such a small trick. The woman put on a friendly smile and said the town was several hours away. She promised they could protect Jim and his sister until their parents came back. Seeing the house stocked with supplies, and even a working fridge, the couple quickly decided to stay for a while. The man, Jack, said he would go hide the car outside. It seemed like they were running from someone, trying to avoid being caught. Late at night, Jim overheard the couple talking. They seemed very pleased with this place. For safety, he and his sister slipped into their safe room, the secret that had kept them alive all this time. The next morning, Jack was already making breakfast, clearly acting like he owned the place. Jim kept a calm face, but then said something strange.
"It will be over before you know it."
When night fell, Jim suddenly asked, "Is it time?" His dog sniffed him, then gave a barely noticeable nod. Without hesitation, Jim scooped up his sister and locked her safely inside the safe room once again. Downstairs, the couple was still wrapped up in their own world, unaware that danger was about to strike. The girl excused herself, saying she needed to use the bathroom. But when she glanced outside, she spotted several zombies crouching near the window. She quickly turned off the lights, thinking the zombies wouldn't see her. But then, suddenly, the door behind her swung open. Jack sensed something was wrong, drew his gun, and rushed over, only to find his girlfriend lying on the floor, covered in blood. That was the last anyone saw of the couple. Meanwhile, Jim and his sister carried on playing as if nothing had happened. Clearly, this wasn't the first time they'd dealt with human intruders. At that moment, a long-haired man was trekking through the forest. He spotted several traps in the snow and soon traced them back to the villa. Suddenly, a little girl appeared in front of him. Before he could react, a sharp sting hit his neck. He'd been hit with a tranquilizer dart. Of course, it was Jim who had fired. Their survival skills were impressive. When the man finally woke up from the drug's effects, Jim was already waiting, gun in hand. After some questioning, the man revealed his name was Dan, a passing Special Forces soldier on a mission to find his wife up north. Jim paused for a moment. There was something different about this man. Unlike others, Dan didn't want their food or medicine. He only wanted his weapon back. Taking the opportunity, Jim made a deal. He wanted Dan to help power the villa. Dan was curious and asked, "Where did your parents go?" This time, Jim didn't lie. He explained that his father was a scientist who had been missing for a long time, and his mother was a security agent who had recently gone on a mission and should be back soon. Dan was stunned when he saw the treadmill powering the house. He hadn't expected the villa to rely on someone literally running to generate electricity. Suddenly, a zombie slowly approached outside the window. Without hesitation, Dan grabbed a nearby discus and charged out to confront it. After dealing with the zombie, Dan returned, covered in blood. Jim yelled, "Why'd you have to kill it?" The windows are made from special bulletproof glass. No zombie can get inside. Despite the scolding, Dan felt sorry for the siblings. He willingly got on the treadmill and started powering the house manually. The night quietly passed, and Dan was nearly exhausted by the end. At some point, Jim's little sister wandered over, circled around him a few times, shouted, "You stink," and ran off. Dan went to the bathroom to wash up, and the thoughtful little girl even brought him a hairpin. By now, Jim had already left the villa. Every morning, he checked the traps around the area to keep the zombie horde at bay. Sure enough, another lively zombie got caught in one of the traps. Meanwhile, after finishing breakfast inside the villa, Dan decided to visit the place where Jim's mother worked. On the desk, besides a photo, he spotted a car key. Excited, Dan rushed to the garage, only to find the car was broken down. At that moment, a room tucked away in a corner caught Dan's attention. Thinking it was a storage room, he was about to check it out, but Jim sharply stopped him. After spending more than a day together, The siblings were convinced that Dan wasn't a threat, so they didn't retreat to the safe room at night. Yet strangely, Jim handcuffed himself. As dawn approached, Dan was woken by footsteps outside. It was Jim on his patrol again. He went back to the trap from the previous day, where the zombie was still trapped but hadn't been dealt with yet. As Jim pondered what to do, Dan suddenly appeared. Instinctively, Dan thought the zombie might be Jim's mother and was about to put her out of her misery. But Jim raised his gun, stopping him just in time. Dan stormed back to the villa, frustrated, and opened the storage room he wasn't allowed into the day before. Inside, he found a blanket on the floor and walls covered with terrifying scratch marks, clearly a place used to keep zombies locked up. This discovery only strengthened his suspicions. Suddenly, the roar of an engine echoed outside. More survivors had arrived, but they clearly meant trouble. They circled the villa with guns drawn, scanning the area. Dan, unarmed, stayed still, unwilling to make a move. Meanwhile, Jim, returning from his patrol, watched from a distance. His little sister stood at the second-floor window, waving frantically. Just as the intruders were about to spot her, Dan appeared out of nowhere and pulled her away. Jim let out a long sigh of relief. Seeing the doors and windows firmly locked, the intruders gave up and drove off. After that close call, Jim trusted Dan even more and returned his weapon to him. Dan felt it was time to leave, but found himself strangely reluctant to go. Then, in the middle of the night, he was woken by the voice of his wife calling to him in a dream. When he woke up, Dan made an important decision. He would take Jim and his sister with him to search for his wife. That way, he could fulfill his own goal while also looking after the siblings. Jim didn't hesitate for a second. He refused Dan's offer to leave. He was determined to stay behind and wait for his mother's return. But just then, loud noises erupted outside. The gang of robbers from the day before had come back with reinforcements, and to make matters worse, they had taken Jim's little sister while she was playing outside. As tensions escalated and both sides faced off, a few gunshots suddenly rang out nearby. Two of the robbers dropped to the ground instantly. Dan rushed forward and managed to rescue the girl. The person behind the gunfire was none other than Jim's mother. However, in the chaos, Dan was struck in the chest by a bullet from one of the remaining attackers. He collapsed, powerless and unconscious. No one knew how much time passed before Dan finally woke up. To his shock, the gunshot wound on his chest had completely healed. Yet, he found himself tied to a post with a thick rope. Upstairs, Jim and his family were waving at him continuously. Still confused, Dan made his way inside and finally learned the truth from Melanie. She explained that ordinary infected people lose their brain functions and are driven only by the basic need to feed. But there was another type of infected, special ones whose brains remained fully functional, just like normal humans, and also inherited the physical advantages of zombies, including the ability to heal from any wound or illness. The catch was that these special infected had a serious drawback. After sustaining severe injuries or over time, they would enter a state of uncontrollable rage, known as frenzy, where they became no different from regular zombies. After hearing Melanie's explanation, Dan finally had an epiphany. Could he really be one of those so-called special infected? Melanie nodded affirmatively. Otherwise, Dan wouldn't have survived a gunshot wound. Instead, he would have died or become a regular mindless zombie. The fact that he only went through a brief frenzy and woke up seemingly unharmed the next day was proof enough. Then, Melanie revealed an even more shocking truth. Jim, the boy, was also a special infected, just like Dan. It turned out that the couple Jim had killed that night was a result of his uncontrollable frenzy. That explained why Jim always handcuffed himself before going to sleep every night. Curious, Dan asked if there was any way to predict when the frenzy would occur. Melanie explained that Jim's pet dog had been specially trained to detect subtle scent changes just before Jim entered that state. That's when Dan remembered the room full of claw marks, the very place Jim stayed during his frenzies. Suddenly, the roar of an engine approached nearby. Melanie, holding her daughter, was facing off against a group of militiamen. She seemed to know the white-bearded leader well. It turned out his daughter had run off with a shady guy, and the worried father had been searching for them with his men. Melanie assured him that if she found any sign of them, she would let him know immediately. Reluctantly, the old man finally led his group away. That night, Dan casually asked about the history of the villa. Melanie explained that the National Security Agency had long anticipated the outbreak of the zombie virus. So, in remote locations like this one, they had secretly built thousands of shelters just like this, fully reinforced with sturdy materials and equipped with independent power systems, designed to be completely self-sufficient. Hearing this, Dan felt a pang of regret. He thought Melanie should have warned others earlier, which might have saved many more lives. but Melanie could only shake her head helplessly. She revealed that Jim and his sister both suffered from congenital heart conditions. Jim's father was a biologist and one of the first scholars to discover the zombie virus. Knowing that Jim wouldn't live past 3 years old, the father took a desperate risk. He injected Jim with the zombie virus himself, unintentionally turning him into a special infected. Tragically, when Jim went into frenzy, his father was bitten and failed to survive the ordeal, becoming a regular zombie. Melanie had no choice but to put him down herself. After hearing this heartbreaking story, Dan couldn't help but admire Melanie's strength and determination. She was always focused on doing everything she could to protect her small family. Over time, Melanie and her family began to trust and depend on this steady, reliable man. One day, without any warning, the dog barked twice, and Jim immediately knew that his frenzy was about to begin. After locking the door, agonizing screams echoed from inside. Melanie's heart felt like it was being torn apart, but all she could do was quietly wait by the door, hoping for the worst to pass. Dan stepped in to take over the watch, perhaps one of the benefits of having a man in the house. But no one expected that the little sister, playing outside, suddenly collapsed. Melanie realized it was a heart attack, and with their limited medical resources, there was nothing they could do. Dan suggested she follow Jim's path and get infected with the virus, but Melanie firmly refused. Jim's case was a rare miracle, and even he had suffered greatly to survive. Ultimately, they decided to let the little sister peacefully pass away. After Jim came out of his frenzy, the family gathered to say their final goodbyes to her, and Dan knew it was time for him to leave. Despite heartfelt pleas from Jim and Melanie, he resolutely set off on his journey to find his wife. With 2 people gone, Melanie and Jim felt the house suddenly emptier and colder. Not far away, deep in the forest, Whitebeard's men stumbled upon the car Jack had hidden. It was almost too perfect to be a coincidence. The couple who had taken over the villa were exactly the people Whitebeard had been desperately searching for. The closest residence to the hidden car was Melanie's villa, so Whitebeard decided to search there next. Meanwhile, Dan, who was sleeping in the snow, was abruptly awakened by the sound of footsteps. Once the noise died down, he stepped outside to find a trail of footprints leading straight toward Melanie's villa. A deep sense of unease washed over him as he quickly made his way back. From a distance, Dan saw the villa swarmed with militia. Whitebeard was there, pressing Melanie for the whereabouts of his daughter after his men discovered a small item she had dropped. Melanie found herself cornered, unable to deny anything. On the other side, Dan quietly slipped past the guards and managed to sneak into the villa. He found Jim hiding in the kitchen, and after learning how many enemies were inside, Dan pulled out his weapon. Like a shadow of death, he swiftly took down the militia one by one. When Dan reached the main hall, several guns were suddenly pressed against his head. But his next move left everyone baffled. He slashed his own neck with a knife. The people around him were stunned speechless, but Melanie understood his intention. She quietly took Jim and slipped out of the hall. Soon after, Dan fully succumbed to his frenzy. Like an unstoppable powerhouse, he quickly took down Whitebeard and his men. This time, Melanie hadn't tied him up beforehand. All she could do was flee the villa with her son. Dan's furious roar drew hordes of zombies nearby. The next morning, Dan woke up to find the villa completely torn apart by the zombies. On the table lay a letter from Melanie. She and Jim had already driven north. If fate allowed, maybe they would meet again someday. Smiling, Dan picked up the doll Jim loved most, slung it over his shoulder, and continued his journey northward.